Today on Film Friday, I take a look at Dreamworks' animated classic, The Prince of Egypt. Let's begin. The Prince of Egypt is a 1998 animated musical from Dreamworks Pictures and the second movie to be released by Dreamworks Animation upon the formation of the studio. It tells the biblical story of Moses, the son of a Hebrew slave who was raised as a prince of Egypt alongside Rameses and would later come into conflict with him upon embracing his destiny as the one who would deliver the Hebrews from their enslavement.
Rameses! Let my people go!
Readers, I think it's safe to say that the overall story of Moses is a very important one, religious upbringing or not. We in the geek community who appreciate comics and superheroes, for instance, owe the very foundation of the fandom to it because it inspired so many characters we know and love today. The story of Moses serves as the foundation for the origin of DC Comics' Superman, until he became Jesus. And the story of Moses serves as the foundation for the origin of Warcraft's Thrall, until he became Jesus. I'm beginning to sense a pattern. But even before I became old enough to piece that together, the story of Moses in the Bible back in the days I called myself a Christian was always a favorite of mine. And that mostly has a lot to do with the fact that there was always a sense of wonder behind it to hold my interest, and it felt like the most complete and easily digestible story out of all the ones that I read. Like, yes, one could say the same thing about the creation story in Noah's Ark, but childhood Laurent was all like, I like Moses because he's a superhero. Also, ironically enough, the story of Moses was what initially sparked my interest in ancient Egypt, ancient Egyptian culture, and the complex Rubik's Cube that is Egyptian mythology. No, seriously, understanding the entirety of Egyptian mythology is pretty much the equivalent of keeping track of having extensive knowledge of every arc of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure while also keeping track of what sets are currently playable in Magic the Gathering. It's a mess. It's a mess that I love, but it's a mess. Oh, you want an example? There were two different sects of Egyptians that had their own king of the gods and each had their own pantheon. Basically the Egyptian equivalent of like Zeus or Odin. Those two gods were Amun and Ra. So in order to unite Egypt, they just fused the two together. And that's why we have Amun Ra. Like I said, Egyptian mythology is a mess. I love it, but she's a mess. Now, to get back on track, for a lot of people, me included, the initial introduction to Moses on film and television came in the form of Cecil DeMille's The Ten Commandments, starring Charlton Heston as Moses and Yul Brynner as Rameses. And for the longest, that depiction of him was the main depiction of him. Give or take a few productions that didn't really get as much traffic back in the day, how DeMille had Moses depicted in his epic was pretty much the golden standard for the figure, especially since it gained the ability to be played on national television almost annually because of Passover and the like, over any other depiction of the Exodus since then. Then Dreamworks Pictures happened because a couple of ex-Disney execs wanted revenge against the mouse, and pretty much changed the game with an animated musical adaptation of the story that completely altered how I looked and interpreted the story, all for the better. In design, in representation, in characterization, and in music, The Prince of Egypt is honestly one of the top 5 films to come out of not just Dreamworks Animation, but Dreamworks Pictures, period. Le gasp! Laurent doing a Film Friday on a movie that he actually enjoys? What are the odds? Listen, I'm definitely entitled to talk about movies that I like in this segment. They can't all range from meh to trash. Every now and then, I'm allowed to give myself a good movie. As a treat. And man, what a treat Prince of Egypt is. The animation is smooth, the background designs are grand, The 3D models they utilize to populate the background tend to blend in with the rest of the movie to the point where you really have to pay attention to what's happening to notice it's a 3D model. Everything worked so well together on the side of animation and artistry. And I don't make that last point lightly, readers. I honestly didn't notice the 3D renders of background characters in Prince of Egypt until I rewatched it to make this video. Now compare that with my all-time favorite Disney animated musical, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I went to see both of these movies in theaters when they came out. When I went to see Notre Dame in 1996 at 7 years old, I was able to immediately notice all the 3D renders in the background. The Prince of Egypt came out 2 years later, and after countless rewatches, it took me over 20 years to notice them. That says a lot. There's also the fact that while DeMille's 10 Commandments was as epic as it was, different time aside, one of its flaws was that there were just so many white Egyptians. Like, Vincent Price was the Egyptian that Moses killed in the 10 Commandments. Vincent Price played an Egyptian. Yes, I understand that black and brown faces were limited in Hollywood in the mid-50s for obvious reasons. But I'd be lying if I said that seeing all white faces in a story that's supposed to feature various shades of brown didn't leave an impact on me watching the movie as a kid. Because once I started watching other movies featuring Egyptians and other dark-skinned individuals from North Africa and folks of proper Middle Eastern heritages, ancient or otherwise, things started to not quite sit right with me. And as much as I respect him as a director, it's something that even to this day, I'm never going to let Ridley Scott live down when he directed his own live-action adaptation of the Moses story, Exodus, Gods and Kings. I was absolutely disappointed in not only his decision to cast white leads in the movie, but blaming the fact that he wouldn't have gotten the proper funding to make the movie if he didn't when he was confronted about it. Especially when Kingdom of Heaven, one of the best movies he has ever made 9 years prior, was able to rake in a profit of $70 million with plenty of Middle Eastern faces on a budget $5 million less than Exodus.
I did not give the cup to you.
No.
So as a 10-year-old boy watching The Prince of Egypt in theaters for the first time, seeing everyone be the color that they're supposed to be meant the world to me, even if they were animated. Seeing Moses' Hebrew lineage properly reflected in his hair and facial features as he got older, and seeing the physical traits that separated Hebrews and Egyptians, yet not done in a way that will cause them to be depicted as racist caricatures, was amazing. You can tell that the animators and the character designers really cared about getting the depiction of every group of people that will be represented on screen in this story as correct and accurate as possible. The only thing that would have made this perfect is if the voice talent matched the depictions. But for who they got, they did a good job. Two great examples in this is Patrick Stewart as King Seti and Ralph Fiennes as Rameses. Despite both of them not being Egyptian, their voices worked for the characters they were portraying. If you didn't know who either of these two actors were for whatever reason that might be, you would have had a pretty hard time trying to disassociate those voices from the characters they belong to because they just fit so well. Hell, I still have to confirm that it was Sandra Bullock voicing Moses' sister in this movie whenever I watch it. The voice casting in this movie is just phenomenal. The only reason why I knew off the bat that Val Kilmer voiced Moses watching this for the first time was because Batman Forever ruined me. Forever. And speaking of Moses, can I just explain why I was incredibly impressed with the depiction of this character right quick? In DeMille's movie, there was never any doubt or hesitation in Charlton Heston's Moses after he decided to go back to Egypt to free the Hebrews. He showed no remorse for anyone but his own people. He never allowed himself to get swept up or tempted in things and people he once indulged in. He was strictly about freeing Hebrews and freeing Hebrews' accessories. A sudden character jump that can only be compared to the montage that took place in Superman 78 when teenage Clark Kent became adult Superman in the Fortress of Solitude. So when I saw The Prince of Egypt for the first time, I was absolutely shocked at how Moses was handled in comparison to Ten Commandments and the Book of Exodus, to the point where I didn't even know it could be done. This was the first time I've seen Moses fragile. This was the first time I've seen Moses exposed. Hell, this was the first time I've seen Moses cry. This was the first time I've seen Moses in such a state of humanity that my very perception of the character and figure completely changed for me. Never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that Moses cared about the actual innocent Egyptians that had to endure the plagues because of Rameses' stubbornness, because I never saw him depicted in that way in either my readings of Exodus or the film that has been the go-to adaptation of the story in America since 1956. Prince of Egypt was honestly the movie that showed me that there is no one set way of telling the story, even if that story is in the Bible. It was almost like, as a comic book reader, finally realizing the difference between superheroes in the Marvel universe and superheroes in the DC universe. On the DC side, you have the ideology and the perfection of a character, them at the golden standard, representing the very core and essence of what their proverb is that you can constantly look up to. Then, on the Marvel side, while they still have a proverb to follow and a code you admire when you see it played out, you're reminded that despite who and what they are, they're just as flawed, scared, and anxious as you are, despite what their grand calling is. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And honestly, the same could be said for Rameses. Don't get me wrong, Yul Brynner brought it as Rameses back in the day. His depiction definitely worked for the angle of the Exodus story DeMille was going for. A cold, ruthless ruler with a profile to prove it, was motivated by jealousy and envy, and despite being Russian America, was one of the only casts as an Egyptian that actually looked the part. So when I first saw the way Rameses was depicted in The Prince of Egypt, I was immediately jarred. I was so used to seeing Rameses depicted in one specific way that it never occurred to me that there was a possibility he and Moses had a healthy relationship once upon a time. There was no jealousy and animosity built up against Moses over time. It was respect, appreciation, and genuine love. He didn't use the fact that Moses killed an Egyptian to his advantage to get him banished. He wanted to help get his name cleared. He didn't harden his heart during Moses' return to Egypt to prove that he was better or because a woman convinced him to do it. He hardened his heart because he wanted his brother back. Now that I'm older, I appreciate this dynamic between Moses and Rameses so much more than the DeMille one. Because not only can you see just how much it pains Moses to do what God is forcing him to do to the only family he's ever known, but you can even see Rameses' own heartbreak over the course of the film as it happens. My only brother, who has gotten me out of thick and thin and that I've loved and cherished my whole life, is now representing a God I have never heard of in order to bring the destruction of the only life he has ever known if I don't give in to said God's demands? Why would he allow himself to become such a harbinger? I thought he loved me. It's that dynamic that the Prince of Egypt brings that the Ten Commandments doesn't, that makes the conflict between Moses and Rameses all the more potent to me. And the fact that you can feel it on the screen from the moment Moses returns to Egypt to the crossing of the Red Sea shows not only how genuine it is, but how much work was put in over the course of the first half of the movie to make it believable and pay off in dividends because of it. But you can really feel that tension and the conflict between the two during the musical number, The Plagues, which, speaking of, is just... It's one of my favorite numbers from this movie for multiple reasons. When you're classically trained in music, you can just hear when something is supposed to represent the wrath of God. The piece, like the plagues themselves, starts off soft, yet menacing. Then it grows, and grows, and grows, until the inevitable impact just leaves you chilled to the bone, covered in goosebumps. This is supposed to be God. And because it even overpowers Moses' lament he expresses in the form of the brilliant reprise of All I Ever Wanted, you believe it. Deliver Us is another one of my favorites when it comes to the musical numbers in this movie because, in my opinion, it did to this movie what The Circle of Life did to The Lion King. It expresses every feeling, every emotion, every curve and bump in the road that is this telling of Moses' story you're going to experience in a way that doesn't spoil it for you, but makes you anticipate the journey that was ahead of you. And just like The Circle of Life, it's so good that it's embedded in you. Whenever you're reminded of the Prince of Egypt, your first thought is either the chorus for Deliver Us or the last lullaby. The fact that Deliver Us has that much power behind it honestly says everything that needs to be said about it. Readers, I promise you that if you haven't seen this movie yet, you are doing yourself a grave disservice because the Prince of Egypt is awesome. You don't have to be a believer in God to appreciate the artistry, the proper visual depiction of the many ethnicities that are usually present in this story, the deconstruction of the usual tropes associated with Moses and Rameses in order to present more of a relatable and grounded dynamic between the two, or how the music plays just as important of a role in the overall film. The Prince of Egypt has so much love, care, respect, and research behind it that I believe it truly deserves a place amongst the classic 2D animated musicals that came before it, Disney crafted or otherwise. This, along with The Road to El Dorado, is the movie that convinced me that DreamWorks Animation is a force to be reckoned with and will be for years to come. So let it be written, so let it be done. Right now you can stream The Prince of Egypt with a Hulu subscription, and you can rent or own it digitally on YouTube, Google Play, iTunes, Vudu, and Amazon Prime. But if you want to purchase it and help out the channel, you can click the link in the description down below. So with that being said, readers, your homework assignment for the day. Write in the comments section below what you thought of The Prince of Egypt if you've seen it. Film Friday is possible thanks to the generous support of fellow readers over on Patreon. So if you want to see more and help financially support the channel, you can join it by clicking the card at the end of the video or in the link in the description down below, where you can also find a link to my merchandise store. Or if you prefer to give a one-time donation, you can find links to my PayPal and my Ko-fi account in the description box as well. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because I post new videos every Mondays, Wednesdays, and every other Friday. But until then, this is Readus 101. Class dismissed.